just want to see it.
How does it look? Oh, it looks good.
Yeah, it was good.
Okay, gang, I'm going to repeat what I said last week when we had Tim Riddle here, that one of the really great things about being part of a program like this is you're exposed to people who study interesting stuff and think hard about things that the general public takes for granted, and that's exactly what this presentation addresses. So our guest today is Katie Lieber. She is a PhD student in our program who studies social issues in sports. She is a former Division I athlete. She ran track and cross country at Western Kentucky University. She has a super long bio here, still active on the WKU site. Let's see, is anything gonna meet, let's see, she ran the mile in 5:14:23, that sounds pretty good. These are all PRs, by the way. She ran the 1500 in 4 minutes, 40 seconds, and 4 minutes, 40.8 seconds. 3,000 meters in 9 minutes, 42.
Yes.
Not 9 hours and 42 minutes.
No, that's probably about how long it would take me now.
Right. Anyway, suffice to say, she was an extraordinary athlete in college, and we're really lucky to have her here. So a warm welcome to Katie. It's all yours.
All right, thank y'all very much. So like Kevin said, I love to overthink about sports. I love sports. I'm also very critical of sports, and I understand that most people in the room here probably are too. So I, last year for one of my rhetoric classes, I had to write a paper that used a Burkean framework. I'm going to explain what that means in just a minute, but what I really wanted to do in this class is I wanted to bring college game day science to the class because it's always my goal to be like sports. We're going to talk about sports today. So I did. I brought game day science to class. I applied a Burkean framework to it, and it turned into a final paper that is now up for publication. So I'm working on that with my advisor, getting this published, because I want lots of people to think critically about sports, and that's what this presentation is all about. So just a quick rundown of Burke. This is like the SparkNotes version of Kenneth Burke. He is a rhetorical scholar who laid the framework for a lot of rhetoric studies and rhetorical criticism. And so basically Burke purports that we are human. Humans are symbol-using animals, so our experiences are defined by symbolic systems. And Burke really steps in when he talks about identification. So we as human beings like to form identification with people or manifestations beyond ourselves. So if anyone is a sports fan, you know a lot about identification, because there's this desire to identify with a team. And so it's a really fundamental human process. It's natural. It's not wise to try to undo that or resist that. We as human beings just like to identify with different things. And so Burkean identification is really interesting because Burke says that in order to identify with something, we have to disidentify with other things. And so when I heard this in my class, I'm like, cool, that's literally how sports work. You know, like that's how a rivalry works. We are Texas because we are not OU, because OU sucks. So that's basically Burkean identification in a nutshell. And Burke, in fact, argues that identification is so sought after in human beings because of the division. We love to hate people. And so this leads to consubstantiality as well. So in being identified with B, A is substantially one with a person other than himself. So if two different people can come together for a common person, that is a common purpose, that is consubstantial identification. So if two strangers can come together at a basketball game or a football game and root for one team, they're consubstantial to each other. So what does Burke have to do with college game day? So I purport that fan identification, so that identifying with a certain team, is contingent on division more so than being linked with a home team. So again, we are who we are because of who we are not as sports fans. I also report that fans are symbol-using animals who use college game day science to define and be defined by the fan experience, so thus fans are consubstantial to each other. And I also assert that college game day signs allow fans to assert their identification through identification with who they are not, rather than with who they are. And finally, I also say that identity by means of division amplifies values of hegemonic masculinity. So let's talk a little bit more about sports society and masculinity, specifically hegemonic masculinity. So Trullo and Ecto note that sport is integrally integrated into society, it communicates and amplifies societal values, and it's really important for disseminating and reinforcing the values of American society. Sport is also dialectical, so there's this idea of winning versus losing. This is something that's really amplified in sports. You can't have a winner without a loser. And so sport is a site of everyday domination and resistance. We have any Marx fans out here. It's a space of creation and recreation of labor power. So it's possible to not only think of sport as a way of life, but also as a way of struggle, especially for non-masculine individuals. So this is where hegemonic masculinity really comes in. It's rooted in Gramscian literature on power relations. And so Gramscian hegemony refers to the means through which those who support a dominant ideology are able to continually produce it and reproduce it and strengthen it in cultural institutions while gaining the approval of those whom the ideology oppresses. So hegemonic masculinity is rooted in the discussion of making of masculinity and men's bodies, and it's defined as a culturally idealized form of the masculine character, which emphasizes this constructing of masculinity and this connecting of masculinity to toughness and power at the expense of women and the marginalization of gay men. So a few distinguishing features of hegemonic masculinity, I combined a couple of frameworks. So we have Trullo and Kaufman. So Trullo notes that hegemonic masculinity is contingent on domination in terms of physical force and control, occupational achievement, division of labor, and heteronormativity. Kaufman notes that masculinity involves the suppression of emotions, and so in order to be masculine, one cannot be feminine. And this links into Judy Butler's work on performing gender. So Butler notes that men are traditionally encouraged to be powerful, strong, tough, assertive, aggressive, and physical, while women are more often compelled to be nurturing, passive, and defensive and submission. So hegemonic masculinity doesn't necessarily mean violence. It can be achieved by force, but it can also be achieved through cultural institutions. And so my main argument is that College GameDay allows fans to identify with and perform hegemonic masculinity through signs and observation of the show itself as a cultural institution. And so my main question is, does Burkean identification through division amplify values of hegemonic masculinity? So let's get into the method. So this is a rhetorical analysis of College GameDay signs that were featured on the College GameDay Instagram handle through week 12 of the 2019 through 2020 college season, so just this past year through week 12. I looked for themes of identification, division, and consubstantiality in that Burkean framework. I chose Instagram because logistically speaking, it made a lot of sense. It's all in one place. There's a date and a location, so I could pick out the context, the rivalries, things like that. And I could also argue that the signs that are featured on social media communicate the best rhetorical effect. So they're the ones that are going to reach out and form those identifications with the appropriate audience. So I found a few themes in terms of hegemonic masculinity. So the signs all communicated domination, occupational achievement, avoidance of femininity, and then the show itself also showed division of labor and themes of heterosexuality. So let's get into the signs. And in true Burkean fashion, I want to show you what identification is by showing you what it is not. So this is a sign from Florida versus Miami. It simply says, a Florida team will win today. It's got the Miami and the University of Florida logos on there. Big, like, I just hope both teams have fun kind of energy. And this is an example of pure identification. So this is not Burkean identification. It's this identification in which there's no strife. So there's no struggle here. There's no real contest. It's just kind of like, yeah, I hope both teams have fun. This was a rare find, and so to me, this suggests that division is the key to being featured on College GameDay's Instagram handle. And the rest of the signs proved me right because they looked a little something like this. So these signs are both great examples of Burkean identification. These were signs that were featured during the Texas and LSU week. So this first one says, I'd rather take a razor scooter to the ankle than be an LSU fan. So again, this is not saying go Texas, hook 'em horns, it's saying we are not LSU fans. Like, we'd rather be in a lot of pain than be an LSU fan. And then this next one is really great, 3,640 days since college game day was in Austin and OU still sucks. Oklahoma wasn't even a part of this game, it was Texas versus LSU. But again, this fan is asserting his or her identification as a Longhorn because this fan is not OU, and that's the important thing of that sign. So you can take the Bevo insignia off and still understand that this fan is a Texas fan and not an OU fan, because that's like our saying, and you know that you are not OU, so you are Texas. These are a couple more examples of that Burkean identification. So this was Iowa versus Iowa State. Hawkeye is the worst Avenger. So you can tell that this is an Iowa State fan because they are poking fun at the Iowa mascot, the Hawkeye. So saying Hawkeye is the worst. This fan is not Hawkeye, and that's what's really important to that sign. So this fan is asserting identification with Ohio State by saying we are not the worst. And then this next one over here, Notre Dame versus Oregon, it simply says Notre Lame. I love the simplicity of that sign, it's very well done. But again, not go Ducks, not go Oregon, Notre Dame is lame. We are not Notre Dame, and that's the important part of that sign. So it's that identification through division, that asserting who these fans are through who they are not. This sign is really interesting to me because it communicates consubstantiality. So this idea that although A is not identical to his colleague B, they can still both have these common goals that make them consubstantial to each other. So two completely different people can still identify with each other through a Burkean framework. So this is a reification of the put it somewhere else Patrick meme. We should take Clemson and push them out of the top 4. This was a sign featured during Florida versus LSU. So again, like Clemson wasn't even there. And both of those teams were knocking on the doors of the top 4. Both teams want to be in the top 4. But what makes these fans consubstantial to each other is the fact that they both want Clemson out. So again, it's asserting that domination, asserting that power, saying we are not Clemson, but we can still be consubstantial to each other because we both want that same goal. So now let's really get into the hegemonic masculinity aspect of college game day. So Trullo notes that the male body comes to represent power, and power is masculinized as physical strength, force, speed, domination, and control. So college game day signs are not male bodies, but they represent identification with male bodies, that is football players and coaches, by asserting who is not dominant and powerful. So these were a couple of signs that communicated that from Michigan versus Penn State. So this first one says, what's the difference between Michigan and Cheerios? Only one belongs in a bowl. This next one, I tried to change my password to Michigan, but it's too weak. So again, asserting their identification with Penn State by saying we are not Michigan, we are not weak, we are not lesser. So again, like poking fun at this non-dominant team to assert one's identification with Penn State. No reference to Penn State at all in any of these signs, but you know that these fans are not Michigan fans. This was another one for Michigan versus Penn State. I've been to the year 3000 and Michigan still sucks. So again, not saying go Penn State, saying we are not Michigan, we do not suck. This one is really interesting, well researched, well done. It's Auburn's resume. So it says the second best team in Alabama. This is before the Iron Bowl, by the way. Second best team in Alabama, lost to UCF, can't decide on a mascot, tackled a dog. So it starts off with this like lack of power and domination, and it kind of goes into these absurd assertions, but the point of it is we are not Auburn because we do not lack power and control. So again, not even saying we are Oregon, go Ducks. It even uses Auburn's colors, but you know that these fans are not Auburn fans, and that's what's really important. And they assert that by pointing to a lack of power and control in Auburn. Sorry, power and domination in Auburn. Up next is occupational achievement. So hegemonic masculinity manifests in sport through occupational achievement that is condensed into stats and standings. Sports fans love that kind of stuff. We love a good stat line. We love to analyze standings. And again, these fans communicated identification by asserting who is not successful, both at the team and the individual level. So this was another one on the flip side of Auburn versus Oregon. 7,000 uniform combos and 0 national titles. So again, not saying go Auburn, go Tigers, saying, hey, Oregon, you don't have occupational achievement, and that's how we're asserting our fan identification. This one is really well done from Florida versus Miami. Fun fact, Florida and Miami have the same number of ACC championships. This is funny because Florida is not in the ACC, they're in the SEC. And so Florida is basically saying like, hey Miami, y'all have just as much occupational achievement as we do in the ACC, but we're not in the ACC. And that's how they're asserting identification, by saying, we are not Miami in that sense. We have more occupational achievement than them. At the coach level, the sign is fixated on individual coaches and their lack of occupational achievement. So this is a picture of Jim Harbaugh superimposed onto the here's where I'd put my trophy if I had one meme. So it says, here's where I'd put my Big Ten championship if I had one. This was again Michigan versus Penn State because GameDay really hated Michigan this year. And again, it's just saying that, you know, Jim Harbaugh has no occupational achievement here. We are not associated with Jim Harbaugh. We are not identified with Michigan. This one is interesting. These two signs were featured during the Alabama versus LSU game. This is interesting in terms of context because Nick Saban did coach for LSU for several years. He won a national championship there, and that's what this first sign is saying. Hey LSU, Saban gave you 1/3 of your national championship. So again, our occupational achievement is not associated with you anymore, and that's where the identification is formed. This next one is very well done as well. He brought LSU into this world and he'll take them out. So again, saying Nick Saban's occupational achievement is not with LSU, it is with us, and that is where, that is essentially where the identification lies. This other sign is interesting too, because there are some other themes that are in there. You've got the avoidance of femininity. You've got, you know, Nick Saban looking very stern, very cross right there up in the corner. You've got the domination. He brought LSU into this world and he'll take them out. So kind of a loaded sign there, but those can also be coded in terms of occupational achievement. And then finally, we have the avoidance of femininity. So Kaufman notes that masculinity requires a suppression of emotions because emotions are feminine, and in order to be masculine, one cannot be feminine. So this was a sign from Texas versus LSU. It is the crying Jordan meme that is admittedly very well photoshopped onto a picture of Bevo. And so for those of y'all who are not familiar with the crying Jordan meme, it's typically used in sport context to denote a loss or like a coach firing or something like that. It's used to communicate negative emotions in meme form. And so that's exactly what it's doing in this sign. This fan is asserting his or her identification with LSU essentially by feminizing Bevo. So by saying, we are not weak like Texas because we are not feminine like that. And what's really interesting about the crying Jordan meme for context is that the photo that's used for that meme is actually a picture of Michael Jordan after he was inducted into the NBA Hall of Fame. So he's actually crying tears of joy in that picture. But that meme is so commonly used to denote weakness and to denote femininity that it really links back to what Kaufman says here, that masculinity requires a suppression of a whole range of human emotions. So no emotion at all, because if you show emotion, you're feminine and you can't be masculine. This is another interesting trend. I had to go outside of my sample a little bit for this one because I really wanted to include these. So these are both from 2017. But feminizing coaches was another way for fans to assert their identification with their own team by putting the other coaches down. So for example, this is from Virginia Tech versus Clemson on September 30th. It says Dabo wears no rompers in reference to Dabo Sweeney. And it's got this horrifying picture of Dabo Sweeney's face superimposed onto a picture of a male model wearing a pink romper. And then again, Penn State versus Michigan in September of 2017, Harbaugh uses Snapchat filters with little flower crown Jim Harbaugh there. So again, these fans are not saying like, go Virginia Tech, go Penn State. It's saying we are not these coaches, or we are not these fans because these coaches are fans. So that's just another example of hegemonic masculinity and how it's used to denote fan identification. So now going beyond the signs to look at hegemonic masculinity in the show itself. So I found themes of avoidance of femininity and heterosexuality. So in terms of the show's layout, for those of y'all who watch College Game Day, it's almost exclusively an all-male analyst cast, with the exception of Maria Taylor. And almost all of the guest pickers who come onto the show to make predictions are men, with 3 exceptions this past season. So that was Laura Spencer, Gabrielle Union, and Joanna Gaines. And this is an example of inoculation. So this is where you protect the dominating ideology by incorporating small amounts of oppositional ideology. So this is like ESPN's way of saying, hey, we know women, like we're gonna stick a couple of them in the show. But it doesn't really do anything to dismantle the hegemony that underbellies the show itself. Especially considering that several of these women, or 2 of these women were used to communicate themes of heterosexuality. So Joanna Gaines and Gabrielle Union were both accompanied by their husbands, again, reifying that structure of heterosexuality. There's also the division of labor. So Trullo notes that hegemony involves the division of labor, so this delineation between men's work and women's work. And you can see this in the game day layout. Maria Taylor literally does not sit at the same table with the men. You know, most of the women who come to College Game Day to make predictions are accompanied by men, and so there's this clear division of men's work versus women's work. And this is also present in NCAA football. So according to the NCAA's demographic database, only 2 women serve as head coaches of football teams, 1's an offensive coordinator, 5 are defensive coordinators, and 50 are assistant coaches. So this all totals for under 1% of representation in NCAA Division I football. And even on the women's side, you see that the stats are skewed. So over 60% of women's teams in the NCAA are coached by men at the Division I level. And so I argue that the selection of guest pickers and the division of labor present in the show itself communicate that College Game Day is based on what it is not, and that is exclusively feminine. And so if I had to wrap this presentation up with just a couple of sentences, I would say that if you are a feminist, a female feminist, a male feminist, if you care about women, you should also care about sports. If you care about LGBT people, you should also care about sports, because the dominating ideologies don't necessarily support people who oppose that dominating structure. And so I'm assuming you all are all in this class to look at sports a little bit critically, and I encourage you to keep that up and still be a fan of it, but you can also have that critical perspective as well. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Katie. All right, so the great thing about having this seminar is that we get to hear from the people in the class. I'll start. I have this question that's been nagging me since I saw this the first time.
Yes.
So the signs they're an expression of wit and genius and wordplay and how could you possibly have that much fun with a sign about your own team?
Yeah, I don't. It's funny because I went to Game Day in Austin, and I had a sign that said, "Welcome to Austin, SU. We'll give y'all the L tonight." And I couldn't think of anything catchy to write about like hookup, like go tech. I just couldn't think of anything like that. So I was like, I've got to take a dig at LSU because it's all about the wordplay, it's about the rivalry. It's been however many days since Game Day's been in Austin and OU still sucks. People love that, and I love a good College Game Day sign. So yeah.
How did you get this curiosity to start this research?
To start the Game Day research?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's funny. So for this Burt class, we had to bring in shows and tells every week, and we had to pick a concept from our textbooks and apply some kind of like some form of our research to it. And so when I read about identification and division, I was like, cool, like that's literally how rivalries work, you know, so it's perfect. I can bring in a college game day side. Like that was just reflexively where my mind went, and I was like, I'll take any excuse to bring college game day sides into class. And I wasn't intending to go critical with it. I was actually like, I'm gonna have fun with the paper for once and not be, you know, super critical about it. But I went critical because I saw the correlations between identification and division and hegemonic masculinity. And it's not, you know, when I talk about hegemonic masculinity, it's not meant to be a put down for men. And I think a lot of people misconstrue that as like, oh, like you must be a feminist, so you hate men. It's like that's not what that means. It just means that there are these structures of masculinity that are harmful at a societal level. It's not a man problem necessarily, it's just the cultural value of masculinity and how America and sports culture in general really amplify those.
Let's see. Simone, do you see any echoes of identity in this research?
Yes.
Okay.
Extremely.
You've got the softball
kind of
right
softball
down there,
thing.
yeah.
I actually have a question for you.
Please.
So, with your research and I thought it was interesting how you brought in like how women were featured on college game day, but like with their husbands or like not at a different table. How do you see that potentially diluting? Do you see that changing to where women would be more included, or do you see that kind of continuing?
Yeah, you know, so I'm actually very critical of like Title IX rhetoric and how Title IX is kind of used to be like, there are no problems in gender equity in sport because of Title IX. But I do see the ways that Title IX has enabled women to integrate themselves into the game. So like, I look at Katie Sowers, for example. She was an assistant coach for the 49ers. Like that was unheard of even, you know, a decade or two ago. And then there's another coach who just got hired, I believe, I want to say with the Panthers. But yeah, so there are more and more women's football coaches being integrated into the game, and I think it's great. So I do think that there's progress there. I don't think that women necessarily need to get our hopes up and be like, this is a post-feminist society, so like we need to stop working on this. Like I still think there's a lot of work to be done. Especially looking at the ways that like women's programs are funded in college sports, like the amount of recruiting dollars women's teams get, the fact that Title IX does not guarantee equal scholarship dollars for men and female athletes. So there are definitely there's definitely a lot of ground to cover in terms of gender equity in sport. But I think it's also important to celebrate the progress, but also to not be satisfied with it, keep going. Yeah.
And also, just do you think it's different in terms of fandom to be a male fan of college game day versus a female fan?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I can tell this like based on personal experience, but I cannot tell you all the number of times I've entered into a conversation about sports with men and I've been like interrogated. Like I'll mention like, oh yeah, I watched the Super Bowl, and someone will be like, cool, what's Bill Belichick's blood type? And I'm just like, I don't even like the Patriots, I don't know. So yeah, I think it's interesting because I think that women, like female sports fans in general, are held to a higher standard. Like you have to know everything all the time, and like even as somebody who researches college sports, I get a lot of my male friends who just like argue with me, and they're like, no, college athletes aren't university employees. And I'm like, well, you know, like I was a college athlete, and you know, I do research. Actually, I had a friend the other day and he maybe played like backup linebacker in high school, and he started off a conversation with me by saying, from one athlete to another, and I'm just like, you and I were very different kinds of athletes, you know, so like, I wonder if he would say that to a male friend, like a male D1 athlete. So it's little things like that 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 kind of make the experience different, I think, for women.
What else?
Yeah, any other questions?
Well, Simone, tell us about what you saw in this presentation that speaks to that idea of identity.
I think the identity through division was something like I typically don't think about. I'm also a rhetoric major as well, so
cool.
I was excited to like see this. But yeah, I didn't really notice, because I don't really watch college gaming, but I didn't really notice how like there wasn't a lot of rhetoric about the team itself, but it was all about the opposing side.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I did look on Instagram for those, and I'm not, I'm not necessarily saying like there's anything wrong with that, because I as a fan enjoy that too. I'm not telling y'all how to think, I'm not telling y'all to like boycott college game day or anything. It's like, I'm not gonna boycott college game day. But I like giving people this alternate perspective, so like if I'm gonna overthink about college sports, I like to share that with people. And that's what critical research is for.
Isaac, how does this idea work into community?
Well, I think it's like that's directly tied with identity. What the whole thing is that when I identify as a part of a community, as like a fan of one team, and that's like a big part of it.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about college game day is it brings so many different people together. Like when I went to college game day in Austin, I was like in this little corner, and it was like LSU fans on this side, and then like a bunch of Texas fans on this side with me, and like we were all like this community. It was a communal aspect. Like we were there for the same reason. Like we had different teams, but we were there for the same reason. Like we all wanted to have a good time, like maybe get on TV. So there was a real communal aspect to it. But yeah, and what's so interesting about game day is that communal instinct is based on who you're not. It's all about, I am who I am because I am not this team. And I think that's really unique to sport culture.
Is there like an underdog element to this too? Because it seems like every time we saw the examples of signs, there was like the underdog against the favorite, the stronger team.
Yeah. Yeah, and that might be an interesting study too. Like, I would love to do some kind of rhetorical analysis on like March Madness tweets, because like you see a lot of those underdog scenarios, like UMBC a couple years ago beating Virginia, and like even going back to like Steph Curry at Davidson. So I think that would be a really interesting study to do, like the underdog identification maybe in sports fan tweets. That'd be fun.
Because there were no signs from like Alabama.
Yeah.
And did you have the occasion to see any examples from like an Alabama or a Clemson?
Where they were like playing the underdog?
No, they weren't. They don't play the underdog.
Yeah,
they don't play the underdog. What I'm saying is, I'm always like working through this off the cuff, but the signs that we saw were from fans of underdog teams trying to pick away at the superior team.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And what I'm wondering is, did you see any signs from the superior teams, like an Alabama or a Clemson, signs against their underdog opponents?
I can't think of any off the top of my head, but I bet if I went back on game day, I bet I could find that, because people, like sports fans, love underdogs, and I think that just creates that bigger fissure of division, because like if you lose to an underdog, like it's so much better to make fun of people when they lose to people they're not supposed to lose to, and that could be another theme of hegemonic masculinity, like that need to dominate people at all time. So yeah, I might have to go back and look at that. I'm talking with Mike about how to edit this paper to get it published, so I might run that by him and be like, hey, is this an angle we can do? Because yeah, I love that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, what do you remember about your experience as a D1 athlete and how athletes themselves kind of take on that mindset of identification through division compared to like, rival teams that you guys would compete against? Oh,
that's interesting, yeah. So let's see, so I ran at Western Kentucky University, so like, we're not like Power Fives, but I do remember that we absolutely hated MTSU. We were like, I don't care who you lose to, we are not losing to MTSU. That's like a big rivalry for us. And you talk about that underdog mentality, like it was a big deal for us, like if we beat like athletes from Louisville or UK, we were like, yes, like, we're so cool because like we beat these guys. So there's definitely that identification through division, that being who you are not. And we definitely had those teams that we just absolutely hated, like MTSU was one of them. We didn't like Rice, so like there were a bunch of teams that we just did not like, and we used that to motivate ourselves. We're like, we've got to beat these guys. It wasn't that like we have to win this meet. It was we have to beat these teams. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible for fans to identify with the team without the need for power domination to be brought into it, and just be able to identify with the team just because like they just identify with that team? and not bring another team into it?
I think off the field, maybe. I think that you can form those ties with the university and say like, my grandpa went here, so I really like this school. But I think the minute that you bring it into a sport context, I think you have to have that dialectic, because you can't have a winning team without a losing team. So in order to be a fan of a team and to seriously follow a team and to want them to win, you have to have that power domination mindset. Because you can't have sports without losers.
So then, is there a way to have sport without all of the characteristics of hegemonic masculinity?
I don't think so. Yeah, I think that, and especially like American sports culture where, where it is so contingent on like winning and there's so much like capitalist gain to be made from winning. I don't think that you can separate hegemonic masculinity from American sport culture. So sometimes it can be really hard to be a fan, when you see it critically like that. So there are a lot of times I'm like, I'm gonna shut down the critic and just enjoy this game. So it's kind of like that conscious decision that you have to make sometimes as a critical sports fan. Any other questions? Y'all are asking great questions, I love it. Yeah.
Do you think the concept of hegemonic masculinity is getting like worse over the years, like over the past 5 years? Or, I mean, I know Simone asked, like, do you think it's kind of not on its way out, but in the format of college game day? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like, is it getting
Like,
worse
have you seen
or?
an improvement in it?
I have not. I don't know if it's getting worse. I just don't really see it going anywhere. One place that I've seen hegemonic masculinity really surface is in the discussion of athlete name, image, and likeness rights. I don't know if y'all are following that, but like the NCAA has been lobbying with Congress, and like it's like there's all this legal stuff that's bouncing around to hopefully repeal amateurism is the goal of that. But I'm seeing a lot of like this power and domination, and I'm also seeing a lot of these issues that are being raised about the economic rights that are mostly going to benefit male athletes at the expense of conversations that would help women athletes. So like, I remember the Larry Nassar scandal at Michigan State, and I'm just like, where was all this political energy, when Larry Nassar was abusing gymnasts? Like, where was all this energy when Jordan McNair died at the University of Maryland? So I'm seeing all of these, these very like hyper-capitalist, hyper-masculine issues being given this pedestal when, women and minority athletes aren't getting the same kind of treatment. And to me, that's very sad, and I'm not saying to not argue for name, image, and likeness rights. I think that's very important, but I also want to see that same energy being given to the issues that really harm college athletes at a personal level too. Yeah.
Well, how do women's sports teams like function within the sports culture here? I mean, besides like obviously the inequalities, how do they kind of overcome that?
Monetarily or?
Like all of the above. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is something that's really interesting to me because y'all know about the XFL just being launched. So I look at the XFL and I'm very torn about it because I'm like, part of me really wants to like the XFL, but then part of me is like resisting the XFL because it's like revamping the NFL and I'm just like, I can take or leave professional football. But I look at the XFL and I'm just like, could you imagine like if a major sports network put that kind of marketing and effort into like the WNBA, like how big of a deal that would be? So I guess my answer to your question is that female athletes just have to work harder. Like it is, I can't tell y'all how difficult it can be to be a female athlete at times because you have all of these like, societal standards, you have like these beauty standards. Female athletes who are too muscular are like are crucified by the media. Like if you look up like Serena Williams misogyny, like that's all you need to know about that. And so yeah, female athletes, you are very much functioning in a masculine environment and there is just baggage that comes with that. And so yeah, female athletes are super hardworking. It's just something that you have to kind of, in a very masculine sense, you have to kind of just power through that.
Did you have one, Bradley?
Yes, does having predetermined roles for women in sporting affect or contribute to that culture conflict?
The culture of masculinity?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I hear a lot of people saying like, there are all these female analysts on SportsCenter, like sexism is over, and I'm just like, is it though? Like, is it? So I think that it's challenging that structure right now, but I don't think representation alone is going to get the job done. You know, because even like looking at some of the statistics from NCAA coaching hires, there's a significant employment gap and wage gap still between men's and women's coaches in the NCAA. And I saw this at my university, Western Kentucky. We hired a new head coach for our men's program. He didn't win a game, you know, when we hired him. We just hired him. And he earned, I want to say he earned $200,000 more than our women's coach, who had made it to the tournament several years in a row. And this guy also got like a free car and like all kinds of benefits. And it's like, you're giving this guy who has never proven himself at WKU all of these bonuses, but then you're not giving that to our women's coach, who is like more than proven herself in that role. And then she went on to coach at Cincinnati, and she's doing great things there. So yeah, I mean, I definitely see it amplified in sports circles. I see improvements, but I'm also am seeing a lot of work to be done. Does that answer your question?
Do you think like even having that, like the fact that like sideline reporting is like mainly for like the females, even having that in place contributes to that that culture conflict you were talking about, how like specific roles?
Yeah, so kind of like putting women in a proper place, kind of a.
Yeah, like them saying,
Yeah.
oh, they deserve to be like a sideline reporter, instead of like contributing to like the conversation or like being a mediator in the conversation, you know?
Yeah, and even in like sports reporting, I see that a lot, where the female analyst is more of like a moderator, like you said. So I think in some ways, I think it does kind of amplify that structure, like this is men's work versus women's work. On the other hand, like I look at, again, I'm gonna mention Katie Sowers because she's awesome, and I'm just like, oh, that's so cool. So like I'm seeing definitely what you're saying, and definitely what I reported on as well. But I'm also seeing some progress, and so I like to focus on both. I like to be critical of what I can be critical on and celebrate what I can celebrate. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a division of labor in college sports for sure, and just in sports in general.
And so Katie, where do we go with this? There are a few people in here who want to be professional sports journalists, and everybody's in here because they have an interest in sports and media. So what do they do with this?
Yeah, so I want to speak first specifically to the men in the room. I'm going to pull a Megan Rapinoe and say, like, y'all need to advocate for women, you know, because that's what Megan Rapinoe said. She's like, why are the guys not speaking up about this wage gap? Because, like, y'all have a lot of power. You know, sports media is predominantly run by men. And so y'all are in the best position right now to advocate for women. And so I really encourage y'all to do that. You know, and that can be something as little as, you know, deciding to report on women's games versus men's games, or, you know, keeping in mind those divisions of labor and including women in your reporting practices. So things like that, you know, keeping an eye out in the media for sexism, for misogyny, for intersections of, you know, sexism and racism. Those are all very, very important things to keep in mind as you're reporting, making sure that, you know, and I don't think I have to say this to anybody in the room, but like making sure you're talking to women as people, you know, and not as objects, because that's something that happens a lot with female athletes and coaches. And then for women in the room, I would say, like, just, you know that you're going into a man's world, knowing that, you know, men might not respect you for what you're doing, and that's okay, that what you're doing is still respectable.
Surely that inspired something.
Y'all have any other questions? Y'all are asking great questions, I love it.
We good? Yeah, please.
When I was reading the paper last night, the phrase that I kept like noticing and reading was like perform masculinity. So it's not even like being masculine. It's like putting on the show of it. So I don't know. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like if you came up with that phrase or.
Oh no, I did know. Judy Butler came up with that phrase. Like I want to say in the '80s. So basically, gender is performative. Like I to put it bluntly, like gender is fake. Like we perform gender. It's something that's socially constructed. So like there's the big debate, like sex is assigned at birth, gender is performed. And so what gender performance means is that you as a man or a woman have a script to follow. So like for men, like these are things that are masculine, you know, like playing sports is masculine, being a sports fan is masculine, having a job, making money, like all of those things are masculine. And then like on the flip side, you have women, you know, like having children is feminine, taking care of a home is feminine, you know, being passive, being submissive, those are feminine things. So we get these scripts that are socially assigned at birth, and the extent to which we perform to those scripts is going to dictate how readily people of a dominant culture accept us. So that's why I look at, you know, the inclusion of women on college game day, and I say like, okay, they're performing femininity in a masculine role, you know, because like they're submissive to the men, they're not sitting at the same table, they don't have that same kind of platform, that same kind of prestige. So gender performance is basically just performing that societal set of standards that we don't really have a lot of control of. It's just something that's assigned to us, something we're expected to do, but it can be resisted. Don McPherson actually wrote a really interesting book called You Throw Like a Girl, The Blind Spot of Masculinity, and he breaks that down, I think, in a way that's very well done colloquially, it's easy to understand, so if that's a book you're interested in, it's a pretty quick read, you can probably get it done in a couple of days, and it lays out the foundation really well from a sport perspective and from the perspective of an elite male athlete who is actively trying to dismantle that structure. So, does that answer your question? Yeah.
So do you think there's something to say about, I mean, I understand the format of college game day, and like that's what I want to do, and as a woman that's up and wanting to be up and coming in that industry, like it is a little discouraging to see that there is a Maria Taylor that's not, you know, like one of the 5 analysts sitting at the table on Saturday morning.
She's so talented.
I know, and I agree with everything you're saying, but I also think, and as an athlete, like you probably advocate for an athlete's mindset versus a journalist's mindset behind that. So do you think there's something to say about like the people, the 5 analysts and Kirk Herbstreit that has played in that position, that they see it from a different lens and that maybe they are the better person for the job? Because like I'm not a quarterback and I'm not a wide receiver and I don't understand, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, oh yeah, I totally know what you're saying. So I was visiting home a couple months ago, and we were watching football, and Beth Mowins was doing commentary on, I think it was Sunday Night Football or something like that, and my uncle goes, I don't mean to be sexist, but, and I was like, this is gonna be sexist. But my uncle goes, I don't mean to be sexist, but like, is Beth Mowins really qualified to do commentary in the NFL? And I was like, is Bob Costas? Like, what sport did he play in college? You know, so like that's the mindset I would bring to that. You know, look at these male analysts that have no experience in sports at all, and ask yourself, okay, how are they more qualified than I am?
Anyone else? Great questions.
Yeah, y'all are
For sure.
awesome. This is so cool.
Katie, do you need to leave?
No, I've got all day. I'm good.
Okay.
I don't want to take up too much of your class, but
No, this has been brilliant actually. So now I just want to shift over. They have an assignment due soon, where they're interviewing a former or current athlete